Welcome to the Greater Montana Foundation Legacy Project, preserving the history of Montana broadcasting and the pioneers of communication whose vision and foresight brought together the people of Montana.
Well, I'm getting the opportunity to sit down and visit with one of the legends in Montana broadcasting, Ron Cass. And Ron spent many, many years in Butte working in radio and then moving on to TV. Ron became the general manager of KXLF here in Butte, president of the Montana Broadcasters, member of the Montana Broadcasters Hall of Fame, and one of the true characters of the Montana Broadcast Association throughout the years. And Ron, it's a pleasure to sit down and visit with you, my mentor, my friend, and you're the guy that told me to stay in broadcasting, and I hate you still today for that.
You shouldn't. You got awful successful from the little kid that used to dump money in the fishbowl at the telethons.
Well, you know, it's funny because that's how we met. I was a third grade kid at the Greeley School here in Butte, and you were the host of the Jerry Lewis Telethon, and many years ago. And then you invited me to join you on the telethon. What we do, 14 years of the telethon together here in Butte?
That's got to be pretty close, Ron.
Yeah, watching our kids grow up and everything else. Well, let's start today's history. What we're doing is building a history of some of the legends and the characters in Montana broadcasting to share them over time. And one of the things we want to start with is a little bit about yourself and where you were born and grew up, and we'll move forward from there.
All right, well, I was born and raised in a little town some people might have heard of in the middle of Montana, Harlowton. I was a Harlowton engineer, was on the Milwaukee Railroad, and I grew up there in town, but with a ranch. I didn't know you couldn't get in a saddle for the first 18 years of my life. But that was physical labor. And then I went to work for the railroad after I come out of the Army, and that was physical labor. Then somehow I got on the radio station one day down in South Dakota, and somebody said, "Hey, you're pretty good. You want to do this?" And I said, "Oh, yeah, if I don't have to work." And that's a brief synopsis of growing up. But yeah, little Harlowton, Montana, in the middle of the state, maybe above.
So you started in Harlowton and you moved around from the military and everything else. You started, you said, in radio in South Dakota? Is that where you actually got your start?
Actually, the little town of Lemon, South Dakota. They'd started a radio station not too long before they got me up there. The JCs there used to take over the radio station once a year to raise money for JC projects. And I happened to get up on the radio with the JCs that day and to pat myself on the back a little, which I never do. They got a lot of phone calls apparently saying, "Who's that guy? He sounds better and reads better than the guys you got working there." So they offered me a part-time job, evenings. And about 5 months later, I quit the railroad and went to work full-time disc jockeying for $90 a week. I about starved to death the first couple of years.
So $90 a week.
Yeah.
I think it pays $95 now, so you weren't doing too bad. So then when you left South Dakota, did you work other places or just come straight to Butte?
Moved up to North Dakota, where I spent 6 years doing announcing and play-by-play and finally into a little sales. And then I was trying to get back to Montana. My dad was really ill and I kind of wanted to get back out here where I could spend some time with him. Didn't make it quite in time. I had a lot of people around the state tell me they were interested but didn't have an opening. So I spent the 6 longest months of my life working for Kiana Radio in Anaconda. And that's not a slam on Anaconda. I love Anaconda, but it was not the most pleasant place I ever worked. But that's where I first came back to Montana at. And I happened to be over here at the station one day. Bill Polich and I, who used to sell for radio here, got to be friends. And I ran into Jim Manning, who was the sales manager at KXLF TV, and he asked me if I'd be interested in selling TV. And I said, "When can I start?" And was here ever since.
Well, let's go back to Kiana. When you came to Anaconda, worked at Kiana, who owned the station?
Jack Boley. Jack and Jean Boley were their names. And how far can I go with this? What they knew about broadcasting, you could put in a teacup and still have room for a cup of tea. So it was kind of tough. But they gave me a chance, got me back to Montana. But they had me selling Butte. That wasn't quite explained to me then when I started, that they wanted me to sell and do some radio work. Well, when I found out I had Butte, and the only 3 accounts they had in Butte were on his list, things were pretty skimpy trying to sell Anaconda Radio in Butte.
You'd like to go back to that $90, right?
Yeah. So, but I spent 6 months there and then bounced over here to the TV business. The first year here, they lost their morning man at XL Radio. So for the first year, I was the morning man at XL Radio. And then I'd grab my sales book at 9 o'clock and hit the street for TV.
So who are you working with? I want to hear some of the names of the people that you might have, also the legacy of Montana Broadcasting.
Well, those days, most of the radio announcers I worked with at KXLF Radio were gone shortly after that. I can't even remember their names, with the exception of, we had a friend of yours there at that time for a short time, Fred Kenny, who's been in broadcasting forever in the radio business.
Still on the air at KBOW in Butte?
I was working for a guy by the name of Jim Obsta, who was managing KXLF Radio at that time. In the TV business, of course, I went to work for one of the legends when I started selling for Jim Manning. Jim was a Craney cohort. And of course, now the best sales award in the state is named after Jim Manning, as you well know. But I worked with Jim then, another old broadcaster, bookkeeper. He wasn't really a broadcaster, but was Mike Popovich, who was a Butte boy that started out being a bookkeeper for Skinny Reardon in the radio business. And then I think Manning hauled him up here to KXLF to be the bookkeeper for KXLF and radio and TV. At that time, Paul Semetzis was they used to have a operations manager at the station, and that was Semetzis. Ed Pice was the general manager here then. Ed Pice, Vic Miller, who was the general manager of KTVQ in Billings, and Cliff Ewing, who was at KR and TV, were all buddies of Joe Samples when Joe owned Cook Radio. And when he bought the TV stations, he kind of took his 3 radio buddies and stuck them out managing TV stations. And of course, I should have said that, Joe Sample, who was Montana Broadcasting Incarnate, is who owned the station when I went to work for him back in 1974. As I say, Pice was manager here. Ed died somewhere within a year after I was hired, and Paul Semetzis took over as general manager at that time. And that's probably what kept me here, because Paul, along with being operations manager, had a good sales list. Cellos and the theaters and Woolworths. And well, when he took over as general manager, he said, Cass gets my account list. Well, suddenly I started making some money, and then I was here ever since.
And you were happy at that time?
Yeah. And then Jim Manning got sick with cancer a couple of years down the road, I guess actually longer than that. I started in 74. I think Jim got sick about 80 and couldn't come back to work, and in 81 they made me sales manager. And then it sounds like I was getting rid of people around here. I used to get kidded about that. A little over a year later, 1982 February, Paul Semetzis died. And I spent a month wondering who was going to be my new boss. And Don Bradley, who's another broadcast name big in Montana, he would kind of ran things for Sample at that time for the Montana Television Network. Bradley come up and spent a few days making sure everything was working, and he took me to breakfast and he said, would you be interested in the general manager's job if I offered it to you? I kind of went, yeah, I guess. He said, well, I've got to okay it with Sample, but he said, I think that's what we're going to do. And they did. And that's my next promotion. And Bradley, at that breakfast, I remember, told me, well, if I give you the job, take care of yourself. I'm getting tired of coming up here to funerals. And I said, well, Don, your job's next. And he giggled.
Did they ever investigate those sudden passings?
No,
of the
they
people you
never
worked
did.
for?
Thank
I'm
God.
just curious.
No, never did.
So we're back to moving forward to general manager of KXLF TV, and you replaced Semetz. What year was that?
1982. 1st of March I took over. Paul passed away in February, and that was a tough one. Paul and I'd gotten to be very good friends. For years in the broadcast business, it seemed like booze and broadcasting went together, and Paul and I were pretty good drinking buddies along with working buddies. So it was kind of a shock when he passed, because Paul was only 52 at the time when
Wow.
he had a big heart attack and left us. Say right after that I took over as general manager and working for, again, Sample and Bradley.
So in those years, who were some of the people that you worked with in the building back up from the time you started up through the time you became general manager?
Well, those early years, our news director, in fact, when I first started at KXLF TV, he was the news department, was Ken Woosley. I don't know if you remember the Woos or not. Ken was here for a few years after that. He then went to work for Eastern College in Billings for years. And I don't know, I haven't talked to him. You see him at the broadcasters meetings when he worked for Eastern. Whatever happened to Tim? Yeah, what did I say? Ken Woosley. I'm kidding. Take a little nap here. At that time, the chief engineer was another name that's been around Montana broadcasting forever, and that was Weldon Paulson.
Yeah.
Weldon went to Billings and spent many years as the operations director for engineering, or engineering director for the company, and then started his own uplink business some years later. Margaret McIntosh was here as our traffic person at that time, and she was still here when I retired. I think she retired shortly after. But as far as actual on-air people, in those days it was Semetz's. Ed Pice used to, when he was still alive, come in here and do the morning news. If he didn't, Ed had been in radio his whole life, and he was one of the good radio guys. I have seen him. They'd tell him it's time to do the morning news. Well, first thing Ed done every morning was he'd sit in his office and read the newspaper just before his nap. But they'd call him and say, Ed, it's time to do the news, 8 o'clock, whatever time we'd done the morning news, I can't remember. And Ed had come running out here and they wouldn't have his news for him. So he'd sit down and rifle some papers and do a news program out of what he remembered reading in the Montana Standard that morning. I mean, no notes, no nothing. He'd just ad-lib a newscast from what he read in the morning paper. They were just different guys in those days. The old broadcasters were characters. But other than that, moving forward on that, I guess probably the most famous broadcaster in the state that worked for me was Jay Cohen at this point. Jay was our news director for several years, an anchor, and he's still anchoring, as far as I know, at KTVQ in Billings.
Yep.
We had so many, people used to holler at me. They'd say, how come you can't keep these news people? You get a good one and they're gone. Well, you know yourself. We were at training grounds at KXLF. We're one of the smallest stations in the nation. And news people, we'd hire kids out of college. They'd come here, and if they were very good, they weren't here very long. They'd get a chance to move up, get a better job. We had a lot of great kids come through here, some that I remember. Tricia Euler, who was probably my favorite female newscaster that ever worked here when I was the boss. The last I seen Tricia, her and a friend of hers had some kind of a business, and I seen them on a morning show. I think it was CBS Morning several years ago. They're in California, and she'd got into something else from broadcasting. A young kid that you and I talked about a little earlier that I don't know whatever happened to him, but Dan Taney was probably my favorite sports guy that ever worked with us.
He's probably in jail somewhere.
Oh, I'm sure.
Yeah, knowing Dan.
But they're names that didn't last too long in broadcasting. Probably the longest working member that I worked with, but at a distance for the most part, was Norma Ashby. In those days, we were still doing Today in Montana, and Norma was hosting it out of Great Falls. And then we'd do a little cut-in segment here with it. But I feel like I've been around forever, and I was just a little kid when Norma started, so if she hears that, she'll be irate. Norma's definitely a Montana broadcasting icon. But other than that, it's tough to remember other than people I worked with around the state. Here alone, not that many. But I did mention a favorite newscaster in Cohen. I'd have to also mention I had the privilege of working with one of the greatest chief engineers that you could ever find by the name of Ron Schlosser.
It's a good one.
When I left, Ron retired shortly after that, but there were I had a lot of great people work for me. I was lucky.
Well, and then you had Cooney, too.
Had Cooney. Cooney was a great sales manager and a great friend. I often said, if I ever met the nicest guy in the world, it was Pat Cooney. I've just never heard anybody say anything bad about the guy. Never seen him hardly get angry. I used to try. And once in a while I'd succeed. You could start to see the fire line up a little bit. But the one thing I guess I pat myself on the back about being smart. I learned real early in the business that if you want to look good, you hire people that are better than you. And I had a lot of success with that. I had a lot of good people that just made my job easy. I could sit back in the office and take a nap and know things were running great.
Like most general managers.
Oh, yeah, most general managers. But like I say, the secret of being a good manager is hiring good people. And I had a lot of great ones.
And letting them do the job.
Worked with a lot of good general managers around the state with the MTN. When I first took over as general manager here, we'd opened KPAX in Missoula. Prior to that, it was just a satellite of KXLF, which is almost unimaginable now. But Joe Sample's son, David, was running that station when it first started as a full station. Cliff Ewing was still manager in Great Falls for a couple of years. And I don't know how far you want me to go and how fast here, Ron, if you want to jump in with something.
No, you're doing great.
Sample sold the stations in 1983, I believe, about a year after I became general manager, a year and a half, to a guy out of Boston by the name of George Lilly. He sold him the 4 Montana stations, and George came out here, and it was kind of suddenly a different ball game with Sample, who was a great guy to work for. As I say, him and Bradley. Don Bradley I'll talk about more if I get a chance, but Don Bradley was probably my hero in this business.
Would you consider him your mentor?
Yeah, definitely. First off, when Sample owned the stations, we were more figureheads and day-to-day janitors, I guess, than managers. We pretty much, this is an exaggeration, but I used to tell people I had to call Bradley in the morning and find what time I got to go take my pee break and what time I got to go to lunch. And because Bradley pretty much ran everything. But it was a good operation. They took good care of us. We had good benefits. It was a pleasure working for Joe Sample and Don Bradley. Well, in '83, this guy by the name of George Lilly came out, and we weren't sure what to expect. And I'll never forget George leaning on the windowsill out here in the KXLF offices. That's where I first visited with him, and he said, I know you guys have been being pretty much ran out of billings. And he said, I want to tell you that's not the way it's going to work now. He said, I'm not going to run this operation. You guys are going to run it. And he said, if you do good, we'll do good together. And if you don't do good, you won't be here. And I kind of went, all right, I get a chance to prove I can do this. And what a great man to work for George Lilly was. I don't think he ever made a decision that he didn't call all the managers in, even if he was buying other stations. He'd call all of us in and run by us what he was going to do, what we thought. He gave us an opportunity. It wasn't huge, but all of us to earn a piece of the business. I actually owned a small percentage of KXLF under Lilly. So when he sold the stations, I made a little extra money. But he was just a great operator. As I say, he made you feel like you were important. He never made a decision without including you. And George owned the stations until late 85 when he sold them to the Evening Post Publishing Company. But to go back into that period, when Joe bought us, Dave Sample left Missoula. He hired Bill Sullivan and put him in Missoula. Bill was the manager of Missoula. Pete Frieden, Cliff Ewing retired. Pete Frieden took over in Great Falls, a great friend of mine, Pete. And Dick Miller was still in Billings. So that was the group running the TV stations, the Montana Network at that time. Pete, later on, was replaced by Don Bradley, back to my Bradley buddy. I never could get away from him. Bradley had quit when Lilly bought the stations, or I don't know if he quit or wasn't offered a job. I don't know what happened at that time. But he went up and bought KTVH in Helena, and he ran Helena for several years. I used to stop over there and visit with him. And then he went on to, he sold that station, and Evening Post hired him to run the Great Falls station.
So Don Bradley takes over Great Falls, and he's up there working with you. So you guys were allowed then, between Sullivan, Bradley, and the group, to make a lot of decisions, and you made your own decisions every day in your offices. You hired the people, you went out and looked for your talent, you did all that yourself.
Exactly, especially under, like I say, Lily. We pretty much did our hiring through all of the management changes here. George, when he sold the stations, moved out to California, bought a bunch of stations, lived out there. In fact, last year, I spend part of my year now in Phoenix. And last year, I got a chance to have breakfast with George Lilly. I hadn't talked to George, well, I talked to him on the phone, but in person for many years. And him and his wife were visiting her sister in Phoenix, so he gave me a call. And my wife and I went out to breakfast with George, and it was great to see him. He was a master at working with people. He just had a personality and a charisma. My wife, after having breakfast with him, said, "I'm getting rid of you and see if I can get rid of his wife." And
She was trading up.
yeah,
Huh?
yeah, just a great guy. But I think I was talking about Bradley. Don and I got to be very good friends through all of that association. We used to have our Montana television meetings, usually in Helena, especially after Evening Post took over, because it was a central location, so we'd go over there and meet. Bradley and I were usually disrupting the meetings I'd tell you a story, but it's not really repeatable on television, I don't believe, but it was a classic story. Remind me to tell you afterwards about Bradley. But we had some great fun. Broadcasting used to be fun. One of those meetings one year, Travis Rocky, who was in charge of the TV division for Evening Post, and Travis was all right, but pretty straight-laced. Well, one year he was over there and it was his birthday. So Sullivan and I and Bradley kind of went into cohorts, and we had I don't know where we found her in Helena, but we had a stripper show up for our meeting for Travis's birthday. Well, that was something else. I can't describe everything there either, but it was, that was the kind of stuff we'd done. It's like, I got in broadcasting. I'm going off on a tangent here, Ron, so stop me if you need to. I got into broadcasting at a great time. Money was still flowing. You went to the CBS meetings. They lasted 4 or 5 days. You met every star. You had the best entertainment there was. You drank hearty. You partied hearty. Even the Montana broadcasters meetings in those days, and I haven't been to one for a long time, but they were, you had meetings, you done business, but you golfed, you rafted, you drank more than you should have. One of my favorite experiences there one year is we were rafting up on, I'm going on tangents here, but I love it. We were rafting up on the middle fork of the Flathead, and I happened to have a chance, so I jerked Taylor Brown out of a boat and tried to drown him in the lake. We got back to shore a little later, and I'm mentioning Taylor because he's another Montana broadcasting legend. We get back, and they had porta potties where we got out of the raft, so I'm in the porta potty after drinking more beers than probably necessary. Well, when I come out of the door, Taylor, was it you?
Yeah.
That just dawned on me. You and
Bryce
Taylor are
Dessman.
waiting out there with 5-gallon buckets full of water.
And Bryce Dessman, there were three
And
of
Bryce,
us.
there were three of you.
It was payback.
Well, I got pushed clear back into the outdoor toilet by a tidal wave. I never did get that. I kept telling Taylor, one of these days I'm going to get you again, but I never did. Anyway.
We could arrange that.
But
Well, we got to finish the story, though, because then we left the porta potty area and we took a separate van back.
was that the same time?
Yeah, it was the same trip.
Is that when I got kidnapped by the two girls on a motorcycle?
That's when you got abandoned. We stopped for a beverage and we abandoned you.
That's
we
right.
lost you.
Yeah.
You're the biggest guy in TV, and we lose you
That's
at
right.
a bar.
And I was out hitchhiking, and these two girls come along on a big old Harley, and they offered me a ride. And I said, well, how are we going to do this? There's three of us. And the kind of big one on the back just said, well, I'll get off, and you get on, and I'll get on behind you. So the three of us, me and these two Harley gals, they brought me back to the convention. That's how I got back that day.
No,
The rest is history.
For the rest of the story, we're already dressed for dinner. Everybody's in nice clothes for dinner. There's a reception going on, big dinner going on. And in walks Ron Cass in his cut-off jean shorts, his, what would you call it, Larry the Cable Guy shirt with no sleeves and the snap up front, baseball hat turned sideways. Really not knowing if his name's Ron Cass when he comes walking in. And the whole convention stops because, first off, we had just then figured out we lost Ron Cass. And this is 2 hours later. And you come strolling in, and you never did go get changed for dinner. You just stayed that way. And I think that's when you were chasing Taylor Brown around a table threatening to kill him.
Could have been. I know that you guys left me at the microphone way too long that night.
Oh, that was a great night. A great night.
Well, as I say, it was fun.
Let's go. Let's just take a second. Some of those fun things that happened. You did a lot of live TV. I mean, there was a lot I know you and I for years did the telethon together, but you did a lot of live TV stuff during those years. And now everything, you tape it and run it back. There are some live things happening now. But there are some great stories of things that happened while you were on live TV. Any memories that come back to you?
Not so much, really. Actually, the greatest ones, I'd have to go all the way back, and you know this, to disc jockey days, because what you didn't get seen. So, I mean, there were a lot of crazy things that went on then.
Everybody tried to get your attention off the news when you're reading the news.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, and there were a million different ways to do it, from setting fire to the news to sneaking in on your hands and knees and sliding a ruler under the butt of the poor guy reading the news. That was always good for and in the news. But in TV, not so much. I'm trying to think of anything because I did, as you said, we'd done telethons together. I think I'd done about 20 telethons. I'd done somewhere closer to 30 live broadcasts of the 4th of July parades.
I used to do those right out of this building, right?
That's where we started. The first one I'd done was with Semetz's, sitting here in the studio with a TV so we could see what was going by out on the street. And of course, in those days, we're both sitting back here drinking coffee and smoking cigarettes and doing the parade. But I can't remember, to save me, anything that really happened live so much as some of the things that happened funny. I remember, if you're looking for humor, one time, did you ever know Joe Boyle?
Yeah, very well. He actually trained me in radio.
Joe had one of the greatest voices.
Still does.
For broadcast in the world. But Joe, you kind of had to set out pegs to see if he was moving. Joe kind of talked like this. And he used to do Art Today in Montana local segments. Well, one year, and I'm sorry, but I always was a clown. I couldn't help it. But Joe's interviewing me. Somebody in fact, the old Bonanza 88 store, a friend of mine ran it, and they'd conned me into being their Santa. So they had a Santa suit made for me. And Joe wants to interview me prior to Christmas as Santa Claus. So we're up here in this studio doing a 5-minute segment. It took us 2.5 hours to do the 5-minute segment. Because Joe had started out, we're interviewing Santa Claus here, and Santa Claus, tell me, I've always wondered, do you deliver all those presents all over the world by yourself in one night? And I'd do a slow take at him and say, Joe, that's the stupidest question I ever heard. Well, he'd crack up. He'd start giggling. So we'd have to stop and start taping. And that went on, like I say, for I think 2 hours. Paul Semetz's finally come out and was standing in the window looking at us, and he finally opened the door and said, look, you guys got nothing else to do. Get this over with. Another time, Bob Bach was our staff announcer, and Bob and I are out here doing the biggest faux pas you ever seen is a Today in Montana segment, but we started ad-libbing. We had no script, we had no idea what we were going to talk about when we started. Somehow we got to talking about these little people that lived up on XL Heights and made brooms for a living. And we went on for 5 minutes, just totally. I loved Bob because he was one of those guys that could do that. Us old radio announcers had to do that. You just learned to ad-lib. If you had something go wrong or something, you just sat there and talked, and you had to make up something as you went. But some of that stuff was the most fun I ever had in TV, just crazy things. But other than that, I did a lot of times the early morning news, which was just out here rip and read. Again, nothing nothing special so much in TV as far as funny stuff went. We used to, I know that we'd done some strange things at the telethons, but we were usually so tired, I don't remember any of them. But we used to, harass each other, nothing else, stand off screen and make obscene gestures or funny faces at whoever was doing the show at the time. It was great. I mean, to get paid for what we done was almost a sin, because it was so much fun.
Jerry Lewis, you had a great opportunity many, many years, because back then with the telethon, you used to go down to Vegas or wherever, Jerry. I mean, I remember trips to California with you and places like that, and to beat Jerry Lewis, and it almost seemed like usually when you were with Jerry, people weren't sure which one was the comedian in charge of the show.
Jerry was great. I think I was probably the first telethon meeting I went down to there, I would guess, was in 76 or 77, so I would have been 33, 34, 35 years old, somewhere in there. Well, to meet Jerry, that was one of the first stars. I hadn't went to CBS meetings then. One of the, not only was a big star, but I grew up on Dean and Jerry together, and then Jerry by himself, and used to laugh until I cried at all of his movies. Well, to get a chance to meet him, and the one thing about Jerry, he was always on, constantly.
Always.
And a lot of people I'd heard over the years said he was a tough taskmaster to work for. But as far as meeting him and getting a chance to work with him a little at those telethon meetings, he was outstanding. I mean, it was, yeah, let's have fun, but don't forget we're here to do a serious business. Jerry Lewis, whatever people think of him, I don't know of anybody that worked harder to do more good for more people. Just an offshoot, and you know this better than anybody. I like doing the telethon because I don't handle sick people well, or people with problems, because I've always been big and strong, and I felt like something was wrong because I couldn't help them. We're doing the telethon, I thought we're doing something for these kids and the other people with muscular dystrophy. And the toughest thing that I know for me is we see a youngster there at the telethon this year that we really got to work with, and they were so brave, they were so up, and we'd work with them, and we'd come back the next year and say, well, what happened to Mary? Oh, she didn't make it. And those were the toughest things in the world. And Jerry done that all of his life. But to work with him, he was great. And I got to meet a lot of other great people starting out there. Kasem always worked with him, another famous old disc jockey. Other people that I met. One of my highlights, don't remember what year that was, but we were going from Caesars out to the convention center for some reason, and I don't remember what. But I got to sit with Tony Orlando on the bus. And we had quite a visit. In fact, when he heard my name, he said, that was going to be my first name. He said, I was going to call myself Tony Cass. He said, my uncle's name was Casaronde or some Spanish name, and he said, I was just going to go by Tony Cass. I said, well, you can't have it. But nice guy, and it was just, I mean, it's a side story, but it was nice visiting with him going out there. So that made all of the meetings with Jerry fun, and I must have met with Jerry, I don't know, at least 7 or 8 years that I remember personally. He had another great old guy that most people wouldn't know that was in the movie business for many years, Sylvester Weaver. Worked those early years. Sylvester, I think, was in his 80s then. He's Sigourney Weaver, the movie star's father. But they were all there working with Jerry, and it was just a great experience. I brought you one picture, but another year I had my daughter down there with me, and Jerry took, as many pictures as we wanted with him clowning, and he was great to work with. One of the, again, back when broadcasting was fun.
Let's talk about some of the people. We talked about Jerry. Who are some of the other people you interviewed or you've had a chance to get to know a little bit through broadcasting?
You're talking stars or people
Whatever, people that really caught you, people that made stuck in your mind.
Well, again, in my early days, I got to go back to broadcasting in the Dakotas. As I say, I was the sports director along with everything else. Let's see, I was the music director, the sports director, the program director.
Forgot janitor.
The janitor. But I've been this is really reaching, but I've been a giant Minnesota fan since they started the Vikings back in 1961. Well, down there, my first interview with a Viking was Dave Osborne, who was a great running back for the Vikings. back in the early 60s, and that was probably the biggest treat I ever had to start with in broadcasting. And over the years, I got to do Gary Larson, Carl Eller, a few of those guys, which was great. Coming out here, going to the CBS meetings, you got to meet a ton of movie stars. Probably one of my favorite, again, because I'm old. You remember the program Dallas? Mm-hmm. Well, in Dallas, they used to have Jock Ewing on it, who was the head of the Ewing clan. Well, he died, and they brought in Howard Keel to be the new Married to Miss Ellie. Well, I got to meet and spend quite a bit of time talking with Howard Keel, which was great to me because I'm a great fan of, well, probably my favorite movie in the world, A Showboat, in which he was in and sang. He had a great voice, but yet he was a big, tough-looking guy. He played an Indian in the John Wayne movie. What was the movie? War Wagon. But a lot of those people, but he probably one of my most memorable. Here, I think what I enjoyed about broadcasting is most of the politicians that I got a chance to get to know. You know this yourself from running a radio station. Whenever, of course, my favorite, I knew him personally and really enjoyed the guy, was Conrad Burns. We went back to Washington the first year Conrad was elected. That was the year I was incoming president of the Montana Broadcasters, and we went back to do our usual stick. Well, Conrad at that time, they emptied out the janitor's office to put Conrad in. He was a new senator. They had him in this little bitty office. But he was so gracious to us. He took us out for dinner. Of course, took us over to Congress and let us sit in there for a while. John Brandt and I went by, who used to be in broadcasting in Bozeman. But Conrad would always stop here when he'd come by and put his feet up on my desk and visit. And Pat Williams never come on the station without stopping in and visiting. Just, you know, so many of them that I learned a lot from, I enjoyed visiting with. They were all very cordial, whether they were Democrats or Republicans. Just enjoyed that. That was fun, meeting those guys and getting to know them.
Those years with the Montana Broadcasters, let's go there. You served on the board at that time. When your involvement, you went through Tom Judge and probably Bob Haney as executive directors.
Yes, yeah. Tom didn't have much to do with it. Haney had bought him out even when I started. But Tom was another guy. I'm glad you mentioned him. Another one of my favorite politicians. I think I'd met Tom once. Just a quick story again. I've got all these quick stories. I'm down in the mall here in Butte, and I think I'd met Tom once. Of course, I think he was smart. He's coming down the hall with one of his followers. Can't think what you call them, his aides. And he sees me coming up the mall about 100 feet away, and big smile, and he waves. He gets down to me and he says, "Ron, how you been? Good to see you." And I'm kind of going, that's when he was governor, you know. Blah, 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 blah. And I left and I thought, how could he possibly remember my name? He meets everybody in the world. Well, I still think, and this is just my opinion, that what he did is when he waved, he told his aide, he said, "I know that guy, who is it?" But however he done it, it was impressive. And I've met, there again, that's just, you know, to sideline, I've met a lot of great governors of Montana that I've really enjoyed. Mostly Republicans, I guess I have to say. Mark Roscoe, Judy Martz, of course, I've known Judy forever. But just good people, all of them. But yeah, I worked with Haney, Montana Broadcasters. Haney was another story. I loved Bob. You talk about characters in broadcasting. He wasn't really in broadcasting as such, but he was attached in a character. Judy Reddy, who worked for him,
who did
was
all the
a
work.
favorite of mine. She done all the work. Haney got the credit, but Judy done all the work. But those were good days, and of course, back even then, I got to know a lot of who I considered the giants of broadcast in Montana.
Who would they be?
Along with the TV guys I've mentioned, Bradley, Vic Miller, Cliff Ewing in Great Falls, Joe Sample, Bob Merrill. But then some of the radio guys, Jerry Black, I got to stop and think here, John Mosier. One thing about when you're almost 70 years old, Davis, your brain starts going. I'm trying to think of some others because I don't want to. Fred Lark. Now you talk about characters.
Yeah, there's one.
And I might get in trouble for this, but Freddie Lark. What was his favorite expression?
Heidi ho.
Heidi ho, that's it. Heidi ho. Freddie Lark from Lewistown. When I was trying to get back to Montana and broadcasting, I wrote to Fred because I, being a Harlowton kid, Lewistown was just up the road. In fact, I was born in Lewistown. So I wrote to Fred, and he sent me back the nicest letter. I've still got it. I kept all those letters from Montana that I didn't get the jobs, but wrote back and told me he thought I was really qualified for the job and liked my resume and everything, and just didn't have an opening now, but he'd keep me in mind. I also wrote to Cook Radio in Billings, or Cook TV, I guess it was then, and Bill Ryer was running it. Bill was in Bozeman for many years after that, bought a couple of stations, but I wrote him a letter looking for a job. In fact, what they had, the only job they had was a sales job. And I'd done limited sales in radio, but I wrote, and Ryer wrote back and said, yeah, we're interested. Well, about a week later, I get a letter from him saying, oh, we found somebody with more experience. So, ta-ta. Well, I get out here and working at KXLF, and I get to know Ryer. Well, shortly after I got to be sales manager at KXLF, I don't know whether I went to a meeting or just ran into Ryer in Bozeman, but I said, sure. I wasn't good enough to work for your chicken blank little operation there in Billings, but now I'm the sales manager at KXLF TV. Ryer says, yeah. Well, a year or two later, I run into him again. I said, sure, I wasn't good enough to work for you in Billings. Now I'm the general manager at KXLF TV. He said, yeah. He said, the guy that he first went to passed on Walter Cronkite, too. So it was fun, but those were just some of the guys that I remember, Lark and Ryer, that I wrote to looking for work, trying to get back out here.
Well, when you were on the Montana Broadcasters Board of Directors, some major changes happened in the association. You guys started a thing called NCSA, Non-Commercial Sustaining Announcements, that had never been done. The association was running about $20,000 a year, and you guys created the NCSA programs. And then this guy by the name of, I believe, Bob Precht, came on board, and he was Ed Sullivan's son-in-law, and you changed the awards, so all the awards broadcasters see. All those changes happened during your presidency or during your 2 or 3 years in the chairs of the Montana Broadcasters. Some major changes.
It was, and that's something, I'm glad you brought that up because we owe a big vote of thanks to Bob Precht. Bob had came in and bought out KECI and their operations and had a lot of knowledge and a lot of pull. And I served on the board with Bob. I'm not sure what he thought of me. I remember we were at a retreat. See, I always got these stories. And he was sleeping in one room with a couple other guys, and I kicked open the door and took a picture of him in his underwear. And I don't think he ever appreciated that very much. But I got to say, Bob was a great guy. I enjoyed having him on the board and working with him. It's a wonder I haven't been killed, David.
They let you live. I don't know why. But, in the changes you guys made, I mean, you took the, of course, Bob was the producer and director of the CMAs, the Academy Awards for years. Ed Sullivan's son-in-law did the Ed Sullivan Show for all those years as producer and director in different positions there. And the Montana Broadcasters Award Show, which is around the country, everybody says, wow. That all started under, the change from just calling people up, handing them an award and sitting them down, all changed under Bob. And the NCSA program, with the money that was brought in through your guys' leadership, the broadcasters went from a, hand-to-mouth type organization and became a very strong organization because of the leadership you guys gave it.
Well, yeah, and I was lucky to have a great board. And as you said earlier, Bob Haney was responsible for a lot of that. We started the Manning Awards back then. Mm-hmm. As you said, it's turned into quite a production, what we're doing. And those guys, along with many other board members that I won't even start trying to remember names or I'd forget them all, put in a lot of effort. In all those awards, I do want to say this briefly because it just dawned on me when we're talking about broadcasting, I haven't said anything, are the direct result of Ed Craney and his family. I was lucky enough to know Ed Craney. He wasn't running this station at that time, but he used to stop in and see us once in a while. And it was a privilege to know Ed and the stories that I heard. But those are, Mr. Broadcasting in Montana was Ed Craney.
Yes.
He's the original start them all up, show you what you're doing. And of course, KXLF, I got to get that proud note in, was the first TV station on the air in Montana.
With Ed Craney.
Pardon? With Ed Craney.
Yep.
I believe either in, I can't remember now, but August or September of 1953, they hit the airwaves with a test pattern. And I think if I remember the story right, that's how they beat, I think it was Kate Cook.
It was Great
Billings.
Falls.
Was it Great Falls?
KFBB, I think, in Great Falls.
I think they actually
I could be wrong on that, but
were on first with a test pattern, as I remember the story. But I wanted to say kudos to Ed Craney, because I'm not sure any of us would be here without Ed Craney.
Well, and let's go back, because some of these awards, and that brings a point up for me, some of the awards that we have, the younger folks that are out there say, in the industry now, well, who was Craney? Who was Jim Manning? You know, these salespeople are winning Manning Awards, and they say, oh, Manning was a sales guy for Ed Craney and Joe Sample. Well, you know, tell us who they were. You worked with them.
Well, Craney is the one that came out here and started the XL radio network. He bought KXLF, and now I'm reaching back in my memory, because I don't think many people are around that still remember it all. But Craney owned the Helena station, or a Helena radio station, I guess, as part of the XL network. He owned Spokane with Bing Crosby. There's going back. Him and Crosby were partners in Spokane. Yeah. Ed, I wish Ed would have stayed in the business longer, because Ed was, when he left, was spending tons of money fighting the worst thing to ever happen to over-the-air broadcasters. It was called cable television. And Ed fought it right up till the day he left the business, because he could see what the rest of us weren't smart enough to see. Even when I started, I thought cable, you know, it's just something over here that don't run commercials, and well, it turned into something huge. But Ed seen that. He was a visionary. He seen that many years back, and he fought. I mean, this was a guy that, if it was something he believed in, he fought hard for, from everything I can find out. But Manning actually ran this station for Craney. He was the manager of KXLF under Ed Craney. And then when Sample bought it, they kept Jim on, but told him, you know, we'd love to keep you as sales manager. So Jim was, again, if nothing else, a very early broadcaster in Montana. That's, and I think one of the, I'm not sure, even myself, why they decided to call that the Jim Manning Award, unless it was the fact that Jim was a broadcaster, he'd been around forever, and left us very untimely with cancer. But he was the last probably of Craney's cohorts. Manning and Craney were thick friends. And I think that had a lot to do with the fact that it is the Manning Award. And even though I understand the kids don't understand it, it's too bad we don't have more pictures of that time, because they should be told to understand it. And by what I mean by not told, but explained to who this Jim Manning was and who Ed Craney was. They were the pioneers of broadcasting. Jim in sales probably, and Craney as far as radio and TV went.
Well, and how many times Ed Craney went to Washington, D.C. on translators, and we would not have television translators if it wasn't for the work that he put in. And even right now, with the battles going on with translators and survival of translators with the digital change, he would be up there fighting that, because he understands how important those translators are to smaller communities. But I have pictures of he and Jim Manning with mules, with equipment on the mules, going up a mountainside to erect a translator facility up on top of a mountain that could reach down into Twin Bridges and Sheridan. And so he might have been a sales manager. Craney might have been the owner of these stations, but they would be engineers. They would do whatever needed to be done.
Well, that's the kind of picture you need to see, that these kids see maybe at the award ceremonies. And that's another story. I've been to all of the translator sites of MTNs, and you don't get to any of them without a nosebleed. It's hilarious.
And he did them all.
Most of them. We actually, under my tenure, put up the one for West Yellowstone, which is on top of a mountain down there that you got to have Sherpa guides to get up to. We actually built that one later years. Well, and the other one that came in after Craney, Weldon Paulson was responsible for the one that High Flats up out of Georgetown, that was our translator to Missoula, because Missoula was just a figment of imagination when Ed was still here. But yeah, without those guys, I don't think any of us would have been here in broadcasting. They were just the starters. And I'm, again, getting to be one of the old guys, but I think they couldn't have named the Craney Awards. You have to call the Craney Awards because Craney funds them. For no
Greater
other
Montana
reason.
Foundation, yeah. And there's another vision.
Of course, there wouldn't have been a Greater Montana Foundation without the Craneys.
Ed Craney not set it up and put the money into it to keep it running and commit his largesse.
Yep.
It would not exist. I mean, the Greater Montana Foundation does amazing good for the state in free over their broadcasting, but also on PBS and documentary things.
Yep.
So,
well, you just couldn't have, to kind of finish that, you couldn't have named it after two better guys and bigger broadcasters.
let's move along and talk about your family, because I know as a broadcaster, your family grows up in the industry with you, and from your parents to your wife and your children, they've all had to live through a broadcaster.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I think my kids have enjoyed it over the years. I've got one kid. I've got three kids, Barbara, Laura, and Dan. I say kids, they're all getting closer to 50 than anything else anymore. And they're good kids. They've all kind of got my sense of humor, especially Barb and Dan. In fact, Daniel is, I wish I could have got him into broadcasting back when you still broadcast, because unfortunately, he's got my sense of humor.
He liked the broadcast conventions.
Oh yeah, he did. He loved them. In fact, the one that we went to where he was pouring the champagne, I think he was 17, and before I knew it, he was, so I'm not sure how good we were to our kids in broadcasting. But all good kids. They were exposed to it. Now my grandkids almost have no concept of it. I've got 5 grandsons, and as of 2 days ago, a great-granddaughter. But I think they all enjoyed growing up in the business. I used to try to take them whenever I could. I took them to a lot of MTN meetings. We used to go to MTN meetings a lot up at Whitefish. Sample liked it up there for some reason. And I'd usually take the kids, and they could play in the pool and do things. I think all of them went to at least a couple of broadcasters meetings. So yeah, and they loved the people. I mean, if you ask my kids who the greatest people in the world are, and they'll tell you broadcasters, except for that, what's his name, Ron Davis.
Yeah,
they're not sure about him.
Yeah, because I think I was responsible for watching Danny that time he got in trouble. So let's talk about the industry itself. I mean, you went through a complete transition. From when you started in broadcasting, they were still using tape. They were still, drawing pictures on cave walls. I mean, you've been around a while. But through that transition to where we are now, what do you think of that transition? What do you think where broadcasting is now? Give us an honest opinion of what you believe is happening into the industry.
Well, again, I got lucky, Ron. I was around in the early days. And to me, it's done nothing but basically go downhill. Briefly, you asked me about tapes, or mentioned tapes and stuff. The first radio station I worked in, we had 2 turntables, a mic, and a reel-to-reel recorder. That was our equipment. When I moved to the next station and we actually had a cassette player, the old cassettes, I was ecstatic. Wow, I get to cut spots ahead of time. Because in those days, even cutting spots ahead of time, I'm sure you went through this. A lot of times the salesman would run in and hand you a napkin and tell you, I promised him I'd get this on the air right now. So you're trying to read the napkin and get a spot out as you're talking. And it was so fun. And you were on air all day long. I mean, you might have a 8-hour disc jockey shift, and you had to be able to keep people entertained during that. If you didn't, they wouldn't listen to you. So I used to make up stories about my wife, she don't bring the laundry in. I had to go out and get a shirt off the line today, and there were birds nesting in the pocket, and just, you've done the same thing, crap like that. TV, when I started there, TV's come a long ways mechanically. We used to send, when we shot news footage, when I first came to KXLF, we shot it on 35 millimeter camera and sent it to Great Falls to be developed before we could put it on the news. As a salesman, I used to take a 35 millimeter slide camera with me when I sold, and if I sold somebody, I'd shoot the slides for their ad while I was there. So, it's changed a lot. But in those days, first off, broadcasting, I can't speak to radio quite as much as television, but it was a license to steal. The business was a money-making operation. Well, over the years, with the between FM radio, now satellite radio, cable TV, the money isn't there that it used to be. So more and more in broadcasting, it's got to be about the almighty dollar. I seen it in television, especially before I left. In the early days, the owners were more concerned with what you did for the community because they were making pretty good money and they wanted to give back to the community. You still do that with your radio station, I hear you. But so much of that has gone away because now it's cut this, cut that, get rid of this because we need to add more to the bottom line. And I understand that because, as I say, we've lost the monopoly we used to have. So do I think it's gotten better? No. Is it what's happened necessary? Yes. And I still think there's a lot of it that's a great business for people. Radio, I can't speak to as much. I've been gone too many years. But if you want to make money in this business and you can be a good salesman, there's still a lot of money to be made as a salesman on radio and TV. For young people wanting to be announcers or newsmen, go for it. There's still, it's great if you've got the kind of personality you want to be on camera, for example, do it. Understand that you're not going to start out making Dan Rather wages right away. Very few people ever do. Yeah. There's 1 million broadcasters and only so many get up in that top 5 markets in the country. But I've got to say I was in broadcasting for about 36 years total. And I loved it. For me, it was the best life I ever could have had. So I would not discourage anybody from giving it a try. But like I say, I don't think a lot of the changes in my own mind were for the better. The fun ain't there anymore, I don't think. But I'm not in it, so I don't know.
It's more the corporate is taking over and the dollar rules now.
Well, even in your case, I'll ask you a question, even though I'm being interviewed. How many individual radio stations are left in the state owned by one guy?
5.
5. See? Most of the stations in the state now are owned by groups. The TV station, of course, has always been kind of owned by groups, but it used to be Montana groups. Joe Sample was a Montanan, and he owned them. The people that owned KECI were Montana people. People that owned Color TV were Montana people.
Yeah, the independent operators have gone away with deregulation in radio. It's changed drastically.
And I understand, again, it's more cost effective. People, you don't buy properties to lose money on them. You have to make money. But it's certainly a different world. See, I was lucky I got in the fun days when the money was still being spent big. Like I say, the CBS meetings every year. I had a chance to be on the CBS affiliate board for a year or so before I retired. You talk about living the life of the rich. I couldn't believe it going to those meetings. Everything was first cabin. And I don't even think that's that great anymore. Everybody's cut back.
Yeah.
And necessarily, I'm not picking on them.
Well, and the networks have more competition, so they're not spending the money they used to, and it's changed drastically. All
I can say from my perspective is I loved broadcasting. I loved the people that I got to work with, got to know. What a great bunch. I love broadcasters.
This programming series is brought to you by the Greater Montana Foundation, benefiting the people of Montana through communication of issues, trends, and values of importance for present and future generations of Montanans. And by the Montana Historical Society, Big Sky, Big Land, Big History. And with the help of Cordillera Communications, with stations in Billings, Bozeman, Butte, Great Falls, Missoula, Kalispell, and Helena. Cordillera Communications, the Montana Television Network.